I know from teaching my courses that a lot of people when they first start in woodwork have trouble understanding grain direction and figure in their wood. So I thought I'd do in fact I'm going to do two videos on it, one on figure and one on grain and grain direction. We're specifically talking about hardwoods here, not so much softwoods like pine and things. This one's about figure, obviously. So, what is figure? Got a board here which sort of shows it quite well. We've got these arching patterns here, and that's what I would call figure. Some people would say, well, that's grain, but I'm sort of being quite specific about my terms here. I would say this is a figure. The grain is I would refer to as being the fibres that run up the trunk of the tree. So there'll be fibres inside this board, you know, from when it was in the tree. And if this board hadn't been cut out exactly parallel with one of those fibres, then they might be running at an angle to the board, and then there'll be a specific grain direction, which we have to accommodate when we're working the wood. Otherwise we end up with tear out and rough cuts, and it all gets a bit hectic. And figure isn't necessarily an indication of grain direction, so we need to be able to read how the grain is running, and I will be dealing with that in a subsequent video. So there's a pair of these videos. I've got a piece of beech here which I'm going to use to talk about how the figure is actually how it comes about. So here's a piece of beech. It's about inch and a half wide, and you can see it's a waney edge board. So this is where the outside of the tree was. The edges here, the bark's been stripped off, but you can see the annual rings that are running across the board. So they're coming across like that. Yeah. Now, if we take one of these annual rings, let's take that one there. If we look at it on the end here, it's coming round, and then it comes down here. You can see where it intersects with this front face. You can see there's a bit of figure showing. It's running down there like that. And then the next annual ring here comes down, and there's the other bit of figure. So you can see where each annual ring intersects with that surface. It creates a line in the front surface here, which is your figure. And then here we've got this piece here. This is where a piece of the annual ring is actually, you're cutting right through the actual flat face of the annual ring, so you're getting that piece of figure there. And obviously when the tree's growing, it's growing irregularly. It'll be, you know, it doesn't grow up as a perfectly straight stem, does it? It's waving around a bit, wobbling around a bit. So those wobbles around create the sort of the erratic pattern of grain. This piece I've got here is a very straight grained piece, but we will be looking at other more erratic pieces later on. But this does, you know, very clearly show how the lines of the figure are created by the annual rings intersecting with the face. If we just have a look at how this would have been positioned when the tree was growing in the actual tree, it will give us a better understanding of some of the other elements of the figure. I've drawn out this sort of fairly rough diagram of a cut through a tree trunk, you know, cut straight through like you were chainsawing or something. So we've got the annual rings sort of going around like that, you know, like you count them to find out the age of the tree. And we've also got these red lines radiating out, and they're what we call the Medullary Rays, and they can have an effect on the patterning of the wood, depending on where the wood is positioned in the tree when it's growing. So if I was to take some pieces and position them in the place where they're at, so this is the piece we were looking at earlier, that would be growing there because we've got the annual rings coming round like that. I've got another piece here which has the annual rings going diagonally across from sort of corner to corner, and then another one here which has the annual rings going more or less sort of parallel to that face there. That's more or less the position they would be in the tree. We've got the bark here, around here, and then what we call the heartwood is in the middle there. If we look at this one, we can see we've got sort of wider grain here. This way this board's been cut is known as crown cut, and we've got wider grain here, and on certain boards that wider grain will be more pronounced. Let's see what it looks like on the other side. Yeah, you can see there's a little bit more of it there, and it might be a lot more wild if the tree was a little bit wobbly in its growth and the annual rings weren't quite so consistent. Then that pattern might be more wild. And we'll have a look at some oak later on, which shows that. And then this piece, you can see we've got the annual rings going diagonally across, and that gives you a very uniform pattern on all faces. So we've got nice straight grain there, straight grain there, straight grain there, which can be quite important when you're sort of looking for stuff like table legs or something like that, which I'll talk about later. And then this one, this is sort of, this face here is sort of fairly wide grain, rather like the face on there. But if we look around here, can you see we've got that sort of flecking there? And that's caused by cutting obliquely through the Medullary Rays. Now we need to look at that in a little bit more detail, so I'm going to go back to working on the bench rather than on the floor, and we'll look at this piece in a little bit more detail. This is that piece of beech that we were talking about, with it showing the Medullary Rays and the unusual patterning on the side. I've tried to get the lighting right so you can actually see the Medullary Rays radiating out. You can see some here, there's two pairs there, there's some more down here, and they radiate out from the centre of the wood. Now when you cut through them and they're sort of more or less at right angles to the face, as they would be here because they're coming across like that, then you get a pattern. You get a very, very thin, small mark go, sort of little. Look, see that little brown mark there, there, another one there, there. So they're different to the figure, which is this main line here and this one here. You can see the little tiny darker markings, and that's where the Medullary Ray has been hit, has been cut through at right angles. Now if we turn it round, you can see the Medullary Rays here are running parallel to the face, so we're cutting through them obliquely, and you can see we're getting sort of this sort of mottled sort of patterning. You can imagine where we've cut through these rays, and because it's oblique, there's a lot more of the area of the ray cut showing. That's what's known as quarter sawn. You can see it's quite clear there. That's known as quarter sawn. It used to be quite prized because it's very stable quarter sawn wood. I've got a piece of oak here which is quarter sawn, and can you see you get some quite sort of eccentric patterning in quarter sawn oak. And it's quite useful for draw sides and things like that because it's very stable. You can see it's all this unusual patterning here. It's all quarter sawn, where the Medullary Rays have been cut through obliquely. I've realised that I'm spending a lot of time talking about annual rings here, but I haven't actually explained what an annual ring is. If we look at this piece here, it's quite a good illustration. Each annual ring, funnily enough, is laid down annually. So if we look at this here, when the tree's growing, in the summer it puts on a lot of growth because we've obviously got the sun and it's providing energy, and then in the winter, when the things aren't quite so good for the tree, it grows a little bit slower. So this darker area here, if we look at this annual ring here, that darker area there would be laid down during the winter, and then this lighter area here, where the growth is a little bit more vigorous, will be done during the summer. So from there to there was a year's growth laid down by the tree, and each year it lays down another layer of growth on the outside underneath the bark, so the tree's laying down additional layers on, on the outside of the tree, just under the bark. And the width of the annual ring will depend partly on the climate. So this one here, which is quite a wide one, it would have been a good summer, lots of growth, whereas some of these ones further out are a lot closer together, which would indicate not quite such a good summer. And in fact, that's the way scientists can assess climate change, because they can look at the annual rings on very old trees, and they can see when was a good year and when was a bad year from the spacing of the rings. It's a bit. I'm going off track there a little bit, but there you go. Yeah, so annual rings are laid down over a year, sort of the wider part in the summer when growth is vigorous, and then the darker, in this case, more dense part during the winter. I talked about this piece earlier. This is the piece where the grain is running diagonally across, and I said it gives you very straight grain, uniform pattern on each face. And I also mentioned that's quite useful when you're looking at table legs and things. So I've got a couple of legs which we can make a table on my beginner's course, and these are the legs that I prepared for a course this weekend. On this one, you can see it's sort of quarter sawn, because the grain, I'm not sure you can see it actually, but take my word for it, the grain is running across like that. So on this face, we're getting a lot of the quarter sawn markings, the Medullary Rays showing. And on this face, it's sort of fairly wild grain. On this face, it's very straight grain, wild grain, then the Medullary Rays. So each face is a little bit different. Whereas on this one, again, you can't see it totally well, we've got the grain running diagonally across, and it's fairly uniform. Each face looks pretty much similar. So this leg is got what I would call unity. Whichever way you look at it, it looks the same. Whereas this one sort of is different wherever you are, which makes the final table a little bit sort of disorganised, really. It's the best word I can come up with, really. Especially if each leg has got a different pattern of grain on it, depending on which face is exposed. So it's worth sort of thinking about that sort of thing when you're selecting wood for your projects. I said I'd show you some wood with a more sort of a wilder crown cut sort of grain. So this is a piece of oak here. If we look at the end, you can see how the annual rings are running. So they're going across like that. So it's from quite a big tree, because there's quite a wide radius on those annual rings. And you can see that the grain is fairly irregular. We've got this sort of pattern here, then we've got sort of a round bit there. And that's all caused by the annual rings sort of slightly undulating as they were going through the tree, and then we've cut straight through and sort of pierced those undulations at different points. So there's an undulation there, so we're getting that round bit there. And then we've got this sort of what we call cathedral arch, this bit here. And you'll notice that the wild bit is down the middle, and then towards the outside, where I've lifted up again, towards the outside where the annual rings are starting to hit the surface on the diagonal, we're getting sort of slightly straighter grain. We're getting more towards the sort of chair leg type situation. If that had come out even further, then it would have been even straighter. I've just flipped this oak board over that we were looking at earlier, just to show you something possibly I should have shown earlier, which is Sap Wood. Can you see this lighter coloured area here, the darker here, and then there's a lighter bit here. This is what we call Sap Wood, and some woods have a sort of very defined sapwood, such as oak, which I think you see it's lighter, and cherry and walnut, their sapwood is very evident, whereas other woods like beech, which I showed you earlier, the sapwood isn't very clear at all, which is partly why I'm showing you this oak piece. But if we look at what the sapwood is, we've got this diagram of the trunk, which I showed you earlier, the annual rings going like that, and the medullary rays radiating out like that. Medullary rays are also used for transporting nutrients, but they're transporting more sort of radially, whereas the sapwood is transporting the sap and the nutrients up and down the tree. So we've got the annual rings going like that, the medullary rays, and this interior part is known as the heartwood, and then around the outside we'd have the bark. And between the heartwood and the bark is an area which is used for moving sap up and down the tree, and funnily enough we call it the sapwood. So when this board was growing in the tree, you can see the annual rings are going like that. So the tree, the board would have been sitting in the tree like that, and possibly it might have been angled over a little bit even, because we've got sapwood there and then we're going into the heartwood. So when it was cut, we cut into the sapwood there, but we were in the heartwood in the other part. And usually when this board was actually cut out of the tree and we had the wainy edge at either end, then you would have had the sapwood showing all the way down, rather like on this board here. Find it. So this is another oak board, and you can see I've actually got the wainy edge there, so the bark is here, heartwood, and you can just see the lighter coloured sapwood on here and here. It's light on the side. No, I haven't cleaned up that side, but you can see the lighter coloured sapwood there and there. Now some people quite like the sort of difference in colour, but others, when they process this board, they would cut off this outside bit with the sapwood there and there, and you'd just be left with the heartwood. So that's a quick look at figure in wood. Certainly not very comprehensive. I've been working wood for 30 or 40 years, and I'm still learning about figure and all the little surprises it can give you. And when you think about it, figure is what makes wood attractive. It's those irregularities and those surprises I've mentioned. So that's figure. In my next video, which I'm just about to start filming, I'm going to talk about grain, and because as I said before, they are different things. The figure and the grain are different, and grain it becomes important consideration when you're actually working the wood. So if you want to subscribe to my videos, there's some sort of sign up button around here somewhere, and if you have been, thanks for watching.